rather than dealing with a problem, whether that's through helping homeless people or actually just arresting people who've committed an offence, they just want more powers. And the thing that does is actually just creates this very broad category of crime, which completely defocuses the state in terms of what it's supposed to be focusing on, because you now actually have the police moderating, controlling every kind of protest or every kind of,
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 164 for the 24th of August, 2023. You might think that you're not familiar with the CE symbol, but you probably are. I'm sure you've seen it thousands of times, even if you haven't noticed it. I can't show you a picture of it in an audio format, but the symbol is two semicircles, the first one making a C, the second one with an extra line to make a capital E, and CE stands for Conformité Européenne, meaning conformity with European standards. And you've seen and ignored that symbol on thousands of different products, electronics, toys, basically any manufactured consumer product. I mentioned cycle helmets on the podcast a few weeks back, that they're designed to protect a cyclist from a fall to the ground, but not from being hit by the driver of a car. Those design standards are codified in the Conformité Européenne system, and you're not allowed to make, import or sell any products in the EU that don't meet those standards. The products are inspected. When they pass, they get to display that CE symbol. The customer doesn't get children's toys covered in lead paint or, hopefully, mobile phone batteries that blow up. It's true that regulations like this have the potential to include malicious requirements that some country sneaks in to try to favour their industry over another. James Dyson, for example, complained that the ratings for vacuum cleaners were done in such a way that they disadvantaged his invention, but the regulations are agreed by the EU as a whole, and everyone gets their shpake. The regulations are necessarily very complex because they cover thousands of different products, and they can be very technical, and they were one of the prime rhetorical targets of the Brexit campaign, including people like James Dyson. You probably know this script by heart, the Brussels bureaucrats tying up our business in unnecessary red tape.
You just get a mass of growing telephone directory size rules and regulations, one after the other, ceaselessly, endlessly. That is actually what the bureaucracy sees itself as there to do.
If the list of EU...
This is Brexit the Movie, a glossy, professionally produced video put out on YouTube by right-wing filmmaker Martin Durkin as part of the Brexit campaign. It's typical of the rhetoric at the time.
The EU is unable to tell us how many laws there are covering different areas of our lives. So we've used some helpful EU databases to make the best estimate we can. Here is regulated EU man waking from his regulated slumber to start his regulated day. You wouldn't think you'd need a law for pillowcases, but the EU has 5. But that's nothing. The pillow inside is subject to 109 different EU laws. As far as we can tell, there are only 11 EU laws pertaining to radio alarm clocks.
It's very typical of the Brexit campaign in the sense that Martin Durkin has no regard for the truth. In this segment, all the things that are mentioned in the voiceover appear in the stylishly filmed routine of regulated man getting up and having breakfast with nifty graphics listing all the relevant regulations over each item.
Sounds about right. Mirrors have been known to crack and get dirty, so they're covered by 172 laws. As for the shower, well, we've all seen Psycho. Murdering girls like that is now strictly prohibited. Shampoo can get in your eyes and cause discomfort, 118 laws. EU bureaucrats seem terrified by towels for some reason, slightly more relaxed about radiators. There are 1,240
Except
laws relating to...
they're not necessarily relevant, as John Oliver observed at the time.
Because we blew up that frame and then went looking through each of the pillow regulations they feature. And the problem is, most have nothing to do with actual pillows. For instance, this one is a classification of a type of breakfast cereal that comes in pillow shapes. This one is related to a merger between two auto part companies that included the phrase pillow ball joints. And finally, this one uses the word pillow in reference to this weird foot pump thing, which is supposedly for inflating air mattresses.
It's not explicitly mentioned in Brexit the movie, but most of the regulation that they're talking about here are CE regulations, and freeing Britain from this burdensome regulation was a core objective and a core selling point of the Brexit lobby. So, after much delay, what was called the UKCA, standing for UK Conformity Assessed, UKCA was launched on the 1st of January 2021 with the validity of CE certification to expire in the UK as of the 31st of December 2021, so a one-year transition period. The British government created their own standards agency to set their own standards independently, free of all the meddling of those evil Brussels bureaucrats. To do this, they basically did a copy and paste of all the existing CE regulations into UK law. They wrote one piece of legislation that said all of the CE regulations as of the 1st of January 2021 are now UK law, and going forward we can amend or abolish them as we see fit. That's not the most dignified way to do things, but it was probably the most practical. They'd never have had the resources to rewrite the whole thing from scratch. They needed to start with some body of law, and the CE system was the obvious one. The CE system as of the 1st of January 2021. Obviously, changes in the CE system after that date would not be reflected in UK law, and it didn't take long for changes to crop up. A very high-profile element of the CE system is those energy ratings that you get on fridges and dishwashers and all household appliances, rating A or B for energy efficiency or whatever, with coloured arrows going from red to green. Appliances have got much more efficient since the ratings were launched. The system works, I suppose. And there was a lot of rating inflation, so we had A star, A star star, A star star star, and so on. But on the 1st of August 2021, a recalibrated system was launched so that the top grade was now called A again, but the standard was much more demanding. And the old A star star would be called B, and A star would be C, and so on down, so it would be more realistic and easier to read. That was launched by the CE, but the UK still had the old system written into their law. So manufacturers were required to have two gradings for their products, the new CE one and the UKCA one, which was basically just the old CE one. Vacuum cleaners and washing machines started coming out with a CE label saying that they were rated, let's say, C, and a UK label rating it as A star. That's a high-profile example, but of course there are tweaks in one regulation or another happening all the time, usually after years of consultation with industry and other stakeholders, though most of the time it's way too obscure to be of interest to anyone else. That makes a problem for manufacturers. A big problem. Having two labels with different ratings is one thing, but instead of having to comply with one set of regulations, they would now have to comply with two sets. Even without any big divergence, that was turning into a headache. If the UK was to actually follow through with the Brexit promise and simplify whole swathes of regulations, that would likely massively complicate the lives of manufacturers. Simplicity ain't that simple. I suppose they could abolish the regulation system entirely, say that children's toys can be covered in lead paint and their car seats can be made out of cheap material that disintegrates and kills them in a car crash, their mobile phone batteries can explode, but, well, I suppose I shouldn't give them ideas. In the real world, that divergence meant a lot more work for manufacturers who now had to comply with two sets of standards. Or they had another option. they could just not bother selling to Britain. I'm sure that Apple and Samsung and other electronics giants would keep selling, but for small and mid-sized manufacturers in, say, the Far East, the UK is maybe 12% of the size of the EU market. Doubling your compliance costs to increase your customer base by 12% might not seem like a worthwhile option from Guangdong province. But there was one set of manufacturers who didn't have an option. If you were a British manufacturer, you would be required to meet the new UKCA standard, and of course you couldn't export a button beyond Dover or Newry if you didn't meet the CE standard. So UK manufacturers lobbied the British government. So the British government delayed that deadline, originally set for the end of 2021, and doubled the transition period, so the CE standards would be legal in the UK for another year. Then, still under pressure from industry, they increased the deadline again, this time by 2 years, up to the end of 2024. Then, quietly, a few weeks ago, the British government announced that the validity of the CE rules in the UK would be extended indefinitely, forever. There is now no doubt that the whole UKCA scheme is going to be scrapped. To spare their blushes, they haven't made that part of the announcement yet, but it's the only logical step, and they aren't making any effort to deny it. This is massive. The British government have, with one quiet press release, tossed on the scrap heap the central, the most iconic, supposedly the most important Brexit selling point. It's not an exaggeration that in terms of airtime, column inches and barstool bores, this was by far the biggest talking point of the pro-Brexit lobby. In fact, it goes far beyond a talking point. It was a cultural phenomena, as resonant as brown envelopes or dodgy planning permissions are in Ireland. It goes back at least as far as 1987, when Boris Johnson was fired from the Times for writing lies and hired by the Telegraph for writing lies as their Brussels correspondent, and he started making up stories about things like saving the prawn cocktail crisp from EU bureaucrats. When Nigel Farage was belly-aching about "This is our Independence Day," this is exactly what he was talking about.
Let June the 23rd go down as our Independence Day!
Not having to follow all the rules and regulations from Brussels. He and others framed it explicitly in terms of not having to obey diktats from foreigners. And, you have to note, this is not the result of negotiations with the EU. This was entirely a British decision, with the rest of Europe, as with most things now, not really caring what they do. This decision was made because British manufacturers persuaded the British government to make it. And the end result is that every crossed T, every dotted I, every full stop and every comma of every European regulation will be law in the UK. The only difference to the position before Brexit is that before, Britain, along with all the other countries, could lobby to make sure that the fine print of the regulations didn't disadvantage them. Now, the 27 EU countries will be at the table deciding the regulations, still able to make sure their interests are protected. Britain won't be. Britain will be outside the door, waiting to find out what the latest diktat from Brussels tells them to do. In a moment we'll have the interview, but first I want to say thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon, especially Carl McCann, who signed up as a patron since the last podcast. I really appreciate everyone who donates on Patreon. We don't get a huge amount of money out of it, but we really appreciate it. It pays for things like web hosting and keeping the podcast going. Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. And it's also a great morale booster when we get a new patron. It lets us know that people listen to the podcast and actually appreciate it. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in the Irish media. You're more than welcome to listen for free. But if you think that you could do the same as Carl and the other donors and throw in 1% of the cost of a TV license once or twice a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
On the line, I have Josie Appleton. She's the director of the, I think, libertarian group, the Manifesto Club, and she's also the author of a book called Officious, The Rise of the Busybody State, which is published by John Hunt Publishing. Josie, what concerns you at the Manifesto Club? What do you campaign about?
We really campaign about freedoms in public spaces and civic life. I think when we founded, we realised that there's a whole kind of swathe of state regulation that's really affecting what people can do in their day-to-day lives. So you can't play football in the park anymore. You can't have a bottle of beer with your friends.
Roll that back there to pause you on that one. When you say you can't play football in the park anymore, is that a specific rule or is that a social convention, or where is that coming from?
Okay, so more and more, there are more and more bans in public spaces. So this used to started happening in the early 2000s with alcohol control zones where the police could take your alcohol away if you're having a beer in the park. But more recently, there is a new power called Public Spaces Protection Orders, and they mean that councils can ban anything they like if they judge that activity has a detrimental effect on the quality of life. So that's pretty broad, and they've used this to ban ball games, skateboarding, covering your head.
Wait, roll back. You say that they have this power. So is it the police who can actually make the decision that this spot football is allowed and this spot it's not?
But currently it's councils, but
okay.
The plan can be enforced by the police, and also the plan is the government, the UK government is planning to give the power to police. So that would mean that the police could make laws to suit themselves, in fact. So
within a specific remit.
Within a specific area, and all they have to decide is that it has a detrimental effect, whatever it is they're seeking to ban. So the thing the police generally want to do is to have dispersal powers, so powers to ban people from an area whenever they want to. So if they think that somebody is going to make trouble, or they don't like homeless people hanging around, they just kind of ban them from the area. So a lot of homeless people have had these dispersal orders. And essentially they're based in a town centre, so maybe they've got certain connections there, they get donations from certain places, and then they're banned from the town centre. They don't have any money, they can't get on a train, they're just squeezed into an area where they really don't have support networks, and it doesn't solve any problems. I think a lot of the move towards coercion, banning a lot more activities, is always sort of seen as, oh, this is the way we make the area nicer, but it doesn't actually solve any problems. It doesn't solve homelessness. It doesn't make an area nicer. It doesn't create a new play park or anything positive. It's just that kind of doling out more and more restrictions and more rules. And I think that really what's happening now, the degree of control over civil society, so, that sphere of life in which we would consider ourselves to be free. So you can do whatever you like as long as you're not committing a crime, you're not hurting anybody. So when I was young in a town centre, it was pretty much, if you wanted to turn up and play your music or hand out leaflets, so I was involved in politics, I would turn up on Saturday, put up a political stall, try and win people over to my campaign. There'll be other stalls and other political groups next door, and essentially that was the town centre. And now in that same city, I know for a fact you cannot put up a stall, you cannot play music. You need to get a license before you play music. And if you want to charity collect, you have to get a license. So the council, in a way, is kind of saying they can control everything that happens in a public space. And that is not then a genuinely public space anymore. It's basically a officially curated space.
Okay. I should say for most of our listeners are Irish, be they in Ireland or around the world. The laws that you're referring to, I think, apply in England and Wales. Am I correct in that?
Correct, yeah. So not in Scotland or Ireland. But
Okay.
I think Scotland has sort of its own versions of some of them.
Yes, not identical, but that will be legislated for by the Scottish government, which is the
Exactly,
usual
yeah.
legislator for Scotland. But I want to roll back to something that almost I think we were in danger of skipping past. You said there, you listed kind of what was and was not allowed. One of the things you said was wear a head covering?
Yeah, several councils have banned head coverings and face
And
coverings, oddly enough.
to be clear, this is, you could be walking down the high street in an average English town and you could be in a place where a head covering is not allowed. Am I right?
I mean, there's basically a couple of councils have done that, and it's targeted at hoodies, in fact. So what often happens is they bring through a law that's so broad that it's ridiculous. So they ban, standing in a group of two or more in the area, in the borough of Hillingdon.
Yes.
The head coverings one is Sefton.
Mm-hmm.
So they could get anyone wearing a hat. Obviously, they're not going to. It's targeted at hoodies. But the fact is they've drawn a law that's so broad that it would catch most people in winter. But then they'll use it against the hoodies or the people that they disapprove of. So I think that is a tendency now. You have a crime, a law on the books that basically everyone's a criminal. And then they just get the people they want to get.
This sounds a little bit like the Judge Dredd principle. Everyone is guilty. We just decide by how much. That where ban on something so broad as wearing a head covering, that is absolutely startling. Has that been either intentionally or accidentally applied, for example, maybe to Muslim women who wear a headscarf, or to a nun who wears a habit, a nun's headdress? Or is it maybe the case that there's kind of a nod and a wink and the law is we ban head coverings, but really this is going to be enforced on teenage boys and the average nun, the average Muslim woman is not going to be interfered with?
I think they generally have an exemption for religious headwear.
Okay.
But they also, there are bans on face coverings, which are actually more common than head coverings, with an exemption for medical or religious coverings. So again, so a Muslim woman could wear a burqa, but then a teenage boy couldn't wear a bandana or whatever. So I think the point with all these laws is it's almost like a kind of message. It's not really a genuine criminal law. If you look back to kind of classic criminal law, they're kind of always the same stuff, which is basically, assault, theft, murder, the kind of classical criminal offences that everybody would recognise. Yeah, that's a crime. You're, kidnap. You're seriously harming somebody, or you're restricting their liberty in some way. And I think there's very much a move away from those kind of classic crimes, which you can define more detail in terms of different kinds of crimes and things, but that kind of classic, okay, you're harming somebody else, you're interfering with their liberty, to a kind of crime that's basically, okay, you're sending the wrong signal, you're the wrong kind of person, somebody else is offended by what you said, or you're making the area look bad. Essentially something that is more of a sort of social engineering crime, like you're using criminal law not to actually punish a harm, but to kind of say how we should dress, or how we should behave, how we should treat people. And that's kind of a new sort of move, and it's quite dangerous. I think that area of life, I think it's very important to have morality and standards of conduct and ways of sanctioning people who are rude or behaving badly. But I think that generally that's not really the job of the criminal law to do that. It's too much of a sledgehammer. And that's the job of civil society, to kind of tell off the young kid or whatever. And that's really only the people who can do that job, and it's their proper role. And so I think that there is this kind of move now with a lot of antisocial behaviour legislation to have the use the criminal law to guide conduct in a very minute way. So the report we just had out this week on community protection notices,
yes, I was going to come to that. So this is what's called a CPN. No, it was next on my list to ask you about. So you anticipated me by a moment there. So this is what's called a CPN. Irish people won't be familiar with this in general, but this is essentially a law that has been brought in the Westminster Parliament covering England and Wales, and a community protection notice. This really does seem like it's allowing the police and councils to just write anything they like into the law. Can you describe what's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, basically, do you have ASBOs in Ireland? Or
In reality,
behaviour
no.
orders?
So, yeah, and this was something brought in by Tony Blair, was the antisocial behaviour order. So something that was perhaps a crime, a very minor crime, or perhaps not a crime at all. Somebody would get an order not to do that. And sometimes it was things that were actually criminal but low level and repeated, which can become annoying. Sometimes it was, people having very loud parties. They would then get an order not to have them too loud or too often or perhaps at all, and if they then breached that order, they would be perhaps on the hook for a more serious crime. This is now being updated into these CPNs, community protection notices. How are they working, or how are they intended to work?
Yeah, I mean, basically, so the antisocial behaviour order, as you said, it's essentially a kind of order outside the normal criminal law that means a particular person could be subject to particular controls. So rather than say, okay, look, you've done, committed drunken disorderly behaviour, or actually having a very loud party is disturbing the peace, and that there's various offences attached to that. And, Okay, so rather than saying you've committed this crime, we're going to prosecute you, they apply separately to the court to get a particular restrictions placed upon you.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and is this on a named individual or on people in general?
So
a named individual, okay.
Particular individual. So the antisocial behaviour order, there were various. There was one young man banned from crossing the street. They were banned from maybe carrying pens or talking to a particular person, or essentially they were imposed, particular restrictions were imposed upon them. And then if they were to do that, it's a criminal offence. For anybody else to cross the street, that's fine. But for that person to cross the street,
and Josie,
that's a criminal offence.
Josie, because I want to check out, some of this sounds so insane that I want to just verify from you that you're not being facetious. You said carrying a pen. Was there a bona fide example of somebody getting one of these CPNs telling them not to carry a pen, and then if they did carry a pen, they would be guilty of an offence?
Involved in graffiti, or something like that. I think, yeah, it was that sort of thing. But the thing is that antisocial behaviour orders had to go through a court, and you had legal aid. So there were definitely some crazy ones, but they were only about, I would say, I think in terms of actually standalone orders, there were only about 600 or 700 a year issued through a court. You had legal aid, you had a defence. So even though there were some crazy ones, basically they were relatively regulated, and the standard was relatively high.
So you would be hauled up before a court, and somebody would say your behaviour, although not specifically criminal, is disturbing and is interfering with the rights of other people, so we're ordering you not to do this, that and the other in future.
Exactly.
And the CPNs, am I right in thinking that they are taking away that judicial process, and just some pen pusher can just sign a form and say that and impose this on you? Yeah. And when was that brought in? What is the quantity of that?
That's 2014. But they've been growing since then. So the first year, there were maybe 3,000. They've grown to basically up to 8,000-9,000 a year, but probably at the moment about 6,000-7,000 a year. So and these are standalone orders. So you're comparing that to 600-700 ASBOs. So it's a big difference. Yeah. And essentially you don't have to go through a court. You don't have any right to defence, or legal aid, or anything like that. And also the standard is much lower. So the ASBO standard was causing harassment, alarm and distress, which is actually, it's a phrase that's been on the statute book since the 30s.
It's a fairly well understood legal concept.
Yeah, and so the courts have established what is and what isn't. So they've established, for example, that swearing at a police officer is not harassment, alarm and distress, even though the police seem to think it is. So there have been lots of things that said, okay, this isn't. So there's a kind of legal case history. The phrase they use for CPNs is detrimental effect on the quality of life. So it's obviously very subjective. Nobody knows what that means. I mean, when it was coming through, I was talking to local authorities and they were saying, you have no idea what this means. And, it's a very broad phrase, and they can kind of get anyone they want to, because if somebody's annoyed by what you have done, even if it's a council officer who's annoyed by what you've done, they can slap one of these orders on you. And exactly, they can write it out on your doorstep, or they can just write it out and send it through the post. They don't have to even have any evidence against you. And
to be clear, this is not a judicial process. This is just somebody who is employed by the council, who may or may not have legal qualifications, most likely wouldn't. And they can essentially say that you, Josie, or me, William, you're forbidden from doing this activity, which otherwise for the rest of the population is entirely legal, because we have some nebulous concept of it being detrimental to a named or unnamed or real or theoretical person's quality of life.
Exactly, and that has been resulted in some very crazy orders in very large numbers. So for people, a lot of people banned from feeding birds in their gardens. Also, they can have instructions, so they can be told that you need to prune your shrubs in a particular way. There's an old lady who was banned from wearing a bikini in her garden. In hot weather, she wore a bikini in her garden. But the neighbours, and often it's about something else. So there was a dispute with the neighbours about building works, and then the neighbours got back at her by making complaints about her bikini in her garden, and so then she got the legal order for that. So I think that it's just so broad and so vague, and actually the people giving them out, you say that they're council officials, but I mean they could be like literally not that far above a traffic warden. I mean, we got the list of jobs of people who gave them out, and you know, some of them are not that different from traffic wardens. You know, very little kind of legal training. Police officers as well can give them out, and actually the police is not, you know, they're just as bad. They kind of get real power trips. So we've several cases of officers who've, you know, maybe someone's issued a complaint against them for something they did, and then they get back at that person by issuing them with a CPN, and that's, you know, we've got like 2 or 3 cases of that happening, and it's almost like it's this blank check that gives anybody in a position of power a right to lord it over people for whatever reason, and that's just incredibly dangerous. So yeah, for those people, then it's a crime to feed the birds or wear a bikini, or there's one guy banned from flying his mobile plane. So essentially, it can impose very minute controls on the way you behave in your garden or in public space. They've also been used to ban people from their town centre. So homeless people, if they decide, as they did in Bristol, that they don't want homeless people in a particular area, they issue them with a CPN, which is a banning order in effect, from the place where they live.
And this is against a named individual, so the person lives, so to speak, well, not so to speak, actually literally, they are homeless. This is somebody who's what has been called roofless, that they are living outdoors, and then, you know, they might be attached to a particular area, or, you know, a place that they might receive charity or, you know, informal donations, or that they might have some informal shelter. They can then just arbitrarily be banned from that area and told that they have to be somewhere else. Obviously, that changes the amount of homelessness by exactly 0, but is it essentially just an aesthetic aim to visually have homeless people not visible?
Absolutely, yeah, and it very much so. There's a particular area of Bristol where there was a young guy there, and he, you know, he had contacts. People gave him money, so people gave him places to stay sometimes. So he knew people in the area, and that's why he was there, because essentially he had community ties, and they issued with him with a CPN to ban him from that area, and that is very much. Certain police and council departments have a policy of just moving people on, homeless people on. They think it makes the area look bad, but as you say, it doesn't solve it in any respect. It's not a social policy in any respect, and you know, they'll say, "Oh, we want you to go to this hostel or whatever," but you know, people often have a reason not to want to go to that particular hostel. You know, maybe there's a lot of drugs there, and they're trying to give up drugs or whatever it is, right? So they have a reason why they don't want to go, and it basically says, okay, either you go, or, you know, we're going to fine you however many £100, or we're going to, you know, criminalise you, and you can get actually imprisoned. So if you break your CPN, to say, for example, you're a homeless person, you get banned from a town centre, you get found in the town centre again. Okay, you've broken the CPN, you get prosecuted, you go to court, you have to pay a fine. They issue you with something called a criminal behaviour order, which says you cannot go to the town centre. You go to the town centre again, they arrest you. Now you've committed an imprisonable offence because you've broken a CBO. So at that point, you can be criminalised, you can be imprisoned. All you've done is been in the town centre.
So you've done activities that for normal people would not involve any suggestion of criminality. You also talk a lot on your website about freedom of speech, and I'm interested particularly in the laws clamping down on protest in Britain, specifically in England and Wales. How do you feel about that?
They're incredibly broad laws, and, you know, criminalise somebody who potentially gave someone a lift to a protest, or or somehow encouraged someone to go to a protest, or it's that drawing. There are already criminal offences of all the disruptive protests that they say they're bringing these laws in to stop. Those are crimes. Like, it's crime to block the M25 and to.
This is, you're thinking of the Just Stop Oil protesters who were blocking traffic, and that is already against the law. Is there an element where they are playing up to tabloid demands and saying, well, we'll make it even more against the law, and that might be legally nonsense, but it plays well to tabloid headlines?
I'm not sure all the tabloids like this at all. I mean, I think it's the tendency to always, whenever there's a problem, they want more powers. Like, more powers the answer to every single thing, rather than actually, look, a criminal offence has been committed, punish that. Okay, just use the existing laws. And it's almost like, rather than dealing with a problem, whether that's through helping homeless people or actually just arresting people who've committed an offence, they just want more powers. And the thing that does is actually just creates this very broad category of crime, which completely defocuses the state in terms of what it's supposed to be focusing on, because you now actually have the police moderating and controlling every kind of protest, or every kind of, has this protest made noise in a way that's annoyed somebody, and therefore can we ban it? I think the kind of incredibly broad, of course, every protest makes some kind of noise and causes some kind of disruption, even if that's just people walking down a road. So
kind of the point of a protest.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, but most people would see that was part and parcel of normal public freedoms, that you have, that you can actually have a demonstration and you have your say and have a megaphone and that sort of thing, right? That's kind of normal, but blocking the M25 is not normal. And so I think that there's a kind of way in which they draw the crime broader and broader, and catch more and more aspects within it. And that's seen as a response to something that everybody would say, clearly this is an offence. So I think it's just that you actually end up disorientating criminal justice and actually effective enforcement, because you end up saying, actually the police should be banning potentially every protest, or they should be supervising it and looking at how loud the megaphones are and this kind of thing, rather than actually just effectively responding to the protests that do seriously disrupt everyday life and affect people's business to go
Josie, I note that you said that you were doing political campaigns in your youth. I don't know which, if any, political party that was for, or whether you're still sympathetic to that. But do you feel that there is any political outlet, even broader than party, in the UK that is more sympathetic to your concerns than any other?
Not really. I mean, I suppose we find allies in all parties. So we definitely have some people in the Tory party who are supportive of certain aspects, but we work with Lib Dems, Green Party in some cases, even with Labour on a few occasions. So I think there is very much. I think right now the party system, it refers to outdated institutions and things that no longer exist. So when I was young, there was actually a Labour Party network. So my great uncle, who was a shipbuilder in the northeast, he was part of the union and the Labour Party club and blah blah blah, and that was his life. And there was a whole social institution that went down to those kind of communities. And I also knew people who were in the Conservative Party and what that meant. And it basically was like garden parties, and it kind of went down to every community that was in Middle England or whatever. So these were social institutions, and they represented a certain class and a certain orientation and a set of values and a section of society, and those don't exist anymore. So they're kind of, the party is a hollow shell. If it doesn't represent society in a kind of meaningful way, if it doesn't feed down to those kind of organizations and groups in people's real lives, then it's a kind of a hollow shell. So I kind of think we find allies in all parties and none, and probably most people are not part of any party. But I think that in a way, the kind of political divisions we have at the moment don't really represent the political fault lines of our day. They kind of
The reason that I ask you that, is because in Ireland, you'll be aware there is a constitution like in every other democratic country on earth, and I think actually every other country on earth, with the exception of the UK and Saudi Arabia. And you mentioned the issue of beggars being victimised. You might be interested to know that going back a few years, there was a case in Ireland whereby somebody was convicted under a British Victorian law for begging. He challenged the conviction all the way to the Supreme Court and had his conviction quashed on the basis that his right to freedom of speech included asking people relatively unobtrusively for money, and the begging laws had to be rewritten, and they now prevent aggressive begging or begging close to sensitive places like ATMs, but the Constitution, we are told, does not allow us to ban begging in general. And the democratic deficit in the UK is becoming more and more salient compared to other Western countries. There is a serious problem in the UK, isn't there? That Parliament has so much power and most MPs are not accessible to be thrown out of their job because of the way the electoral system is set up.
I think that's right. I think in a way, if you look back to the 18th or 19th century, then England was always seen as the most liberal place in Europe. French people going there would always say it's amazing how English liberties, there's nothing like it. I think that it was very different. It wasn't built on a constitution, like in other places. So it wasn't kind of guaranteed set of rights, but there was. But
it was built on essentially on a decent chaps don't do that sort of thing sort of ethic.
Exactly.
And all of a sudden we have not very decent chaps in politics, and that whole system collapses.
Correct. So I think that's the thing. It's a system that, in a way, in the best of times, it's the best system. In the worst of times, it's the worst system, because if you have a very liberal culture, then actually it's a more genuine foundation for liberty, rather than saying, "Oh, we're free because it says so on the law book." It's like, no, we're free because we believe it and we live it, and that's the principle for life. But like you say, now there are no safeguards, and so things can get overridden very quickly. So I mean, countries like France have, in some ways, more protections, certainly because they have a tradition of quite a lot of executive power. So they also have a lot of institutions for checking that executive power. So you've got the administrative courts, for example, which you can kind of bring a case against any official for misuse of their power, for example. But I think because England doesn't have a tradition of lots of executive power, they don't have any ways of dealing with that, and so it is in many ways the kind of worst system now. But I think there is still a kind of libertarian culture in England, and I think that's what we would appeal to, is that kind of, particularly maybe older generations have a kind of historical memory of this is not the way you should do things, and so a lot of the recipients of community protection notices, for example, are pensioners, and they're very kind of stalwart in terms of it cannot be right that I can be held up for a crime without having been through a court, without having had my rights respected, and they are very determined to fight for what they see as their due.
Okay, I want to push back on, because I'm noticing you've got a huge amount of topics covered on your website, but just one or two that might be maybe a little bit more questionable. One of them, you are essentially lamenting the lack of freedom of speech of people protesting outside abortion clinics. Isn't it the case that at very sensitive places like that, people can do things that, if done once or twice, would not appear, or, done relatively inobtrusively or done by one or two people, would not appear to be a crime, would not rise to be a crime. But when it is concentrated against people at a vulnerable time by a large number of people and repeated, for example, very obtrusive and sometimes quite aggressive protests at an abortion clinic, that does begin to infringe the rights of the women who want to go into that place. And there are some limits there whereby a type of behaviour that normally is not considered criminal, at a sufficient volume, it does rise to a level that does have to be dealt with by the law, doesn't it?
Yeah, we never said that there should be a right to have aggressive protests outside abortion clinics. I think that the principle I'd say is that any kind of legislation has to actually tackle harmful behaviours.
Mm-hmm.
So that has to be things like obstruction, which shouldn't be allowed. You shouldn't be allowed to stand in someone's way and stop them going, or harassment or anything that could be harassing. So I think that there were some cases of using model fetuses and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, insulting.
Deal with Josie. Deal with my point that if
was drawn.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead first.
So broadly that it includes cases of silent prayer. So there have been several arrests for people who were standing outside an abortion clinic with their eyes closed, saying nothing. There have been several arrests for that offence. And that is because the law was drawn so broadly to include any expression of any opinion, including prayer. And so, yeah, 3 people, there have been 3 arrests for that, for silent prayer. And I think that is nuts. I mean, I think there has to be some kind of harmful act or some kind of intervention with someone's liberties. The point is that not everyone, I mean, I completely support free abortion and women's right to choose. Not everyone agrees with that. And for people who think it is murder, they, if I knew or if I thought that people being murdered in a house, then I would want to go to that house and try and stop them being murdered, right?
Sure, but that's a criminal offence.
Of course, but I'm saying for Catholics, they believe
I understand. Yes. Some Catholics do, yes.
For them, the abortion clinic is a site of murder. I don't agree with that, right? But that's their view, and so I think that they should be able to express that view as long as it does not interfere.
Sure, I don't want to deal with that issue specifically. But for example, you gave the example of yourself, leafleting or campaigning in your youth in the street or whatever, and you have a right in terms of freedom of expression to go up to somebody and says, "Hey, will you please take a leaflet? Hey, what do you think about this cause? Will you join us on this?" Or try to persuade them to join you on that. But if you then have a very large number of people doing that same thing to a relatively small and very targeted number of people, the same action by any one individual, but just repeated by an organised group, deal with the issue that one action can be perfectly innocent in one context and actually really quite abusive in another.
Sure, but I mean, so then maybe you regulate the number of people there. I mean, I went to some of these abortion clinics that have the PSPOs, and they I think they had 2 or 3 people outside, and they're generally old ladies saying, "Would you like a leaflet?" I mean, that was it. And so, I mean, I think, there may have been cases when there were protests that weren't okay, but I think that was really, from what I saw, there was no interference with people's ability to access it. They were old ladies saying, "Would you like a leaflet?" And most people said no. Apparently, the group says that a certain number of people took their offer of support and essentially carried on and had the child, and they helped raise the child, so they supported the children in terms of giving them clothes and even accommodation. So a certain number of women who were going to that place wanted to have an abortion because they couldn't afford to, maybe, have the child, and they took the help of the groups. I mean, I don't know why women are visiting the clinic. I don't know, what's right. Essentially, you should, if it's an unobtrusive protest, allow it, and then people will find their own way. The vast majority of women know what they're doing, will go in and have the abortion. Maybe there's 1 or 2, and certainly the groups that they support, I don't know, 100 or 200 women or something, who decide, actually, you know what, I'm only having this abortion because I can't afford it. I'm going to take this group to help and have the baby. And there were certain women who say they were really pleased that they did that. Now, that is fine. You know what I mean? It's not for the council to say that these people cannot meet these other people. Yes, they cannot interfere with them, but actually, if they're saying, "Do you want a leaflet?" and if 1 or 2 women decide they want to have the baby because of the leaflet, well, that's fine as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, I want to ask you just one final question, and this has perhaps cropped up in the United States more than elsewhere, and it's a case whereby what is presented as libertarian rights enforcement and so forth very often is industry lobbying in disguise, in particular industries lobbying against regulation. And I notice that you have a campaign against outdoor smoking bans on your website, and you link directly to the organisation Forest and their website, and you describe them as a smokers' rights group. That's not true. Forest is an industry lobbyist. They are funded by the tobacco industry. Isn't it a bit dangerous? And by the way, outdoor smoking bans are not that unusual. Even when I was in Thailand, in many streets and in all parks, you're not permitted to smoke, and that does certainly make the place significantly more pleasant if you're not a smoker. That isn't a one-sided issue. And, you can say people have a right to smoke, and I think they do, so far as they don't interfere with other people's rights. But that is a balance of rights, isn't it? It's not something that is just somebody has a right that is being infringed by the government without good cause.
I think a lot of the outdoor smoking bans are, on beaches, in parks. I mean, I don't smoke and I don't like smoking, but I don't find people smoking outside, infringes upon my rights. I think, very occasionally, you might have to move a bench, but in the same way as someone having a very loud conversation or someone, some kind of really annoying kids or whatever. I think the point is that part of being in a public space is adjusting to people around you who are doing different things to yourself and have different tastes and different activities. And we know we're certainly not funded by industry, or else we would be a lot less broke than we are. And Forest, as I've known Simon Clark, who runs Forest, for years, and he's actually a pretty independent spirit. I'm not sure what his I know that they get money from companies. But
they are funded by the tobacco industry.
Completely, yeah, that's true. But I also know that they do their own thing and they do what they believe, and occasionally they've lost funding for campaigns that they've done against what the industry wanted. So I think that they are, pretty. They support, as they see it, smokers' rights, and and have lost funding as a result of various campaigns. So I think they're a pretty free-spirited bunch.
Yes, but dealing with the issue that you do have a conflict of rights there, and one side on that conflict has, just by the technical nature of it, has the ability to impose upon the other at least an unpleasantness. And if somebody is smoking just upwind of you, be it on a beach or on a park bench or whatever, that can be pretty unpleasant, and you don't have any way to essentially fight back against that or to resist that socially, given the nature of the activity. It is reasonable to say that, and I mean, the argument was made some decades back for smoking indoors as well. It's not a thing that is symmetrical. One person's activity can affect another person in an asymmetrical way that the person being affected cannot resist without recourse to the rules and laws of our society. And there do have to be some of those laws, don't there?
Well, I think if someone's smoking upwind of me, I would just move if I didn't like it. I mean, the point is you do have recourse. You don't need a law to deal with, like, where you sit on a beach.
Mm-hmm.
You get a little bit of smoke, you don't like it. Just like if you don't like someone's conversation, it's like, do we need a law to say that no one can have an annoying conversation next to anybody else?
But that's a symmetrical issue, though. That could happen in both directions.
Well, that's true, but then maybe I have certain activities in public that other people don't like. The point is, I think that being a free citizen in a public space requires a bit of live and let live.
Mm-hmm.
It's like being a good neighbour. You've got to have a little bit. Like, yeah, no, I wouldn't do that. I don't like your music, but you know what? You're my neighbour. We're going to rub along, and I'm going to give you a bit of give and take, and I expect the same from you. I think that's part of losing that art, of losing the art of basically saying, that basic kind of a bit of tolerance and live and let live is essential if we want to be free. Because if you say, okay, you know what, you can't, I don't like smoking, I'm going to get the government to regulate it. And maybe you're a fitness fanatic, and the council then says, oh, you can't have fitness classes in parks. You can't have your kind of community yoga. You can't do that anymore because someone else doesn't like it because they want to play cricket and you're on their spot. The point is that it's much better if we can sort these things out for ourselves and negotiate those everyday, pleasures and also minor annoyances. I think that's two sides of the same coin. And the more that we kind of expect the council to say to make our kind of public experience like 100% non-negative, nobody ever does anything that annoys me or that I find slightly unpleasant. That's not real life. And the more you go down that route, the more that that you're going to invite the council to restrict you at the next term, something that you want to do.
Josie Appleton, the author of Officious, The Rise of the Busybody State, published by John Hunt Publishing, also director of the Manifesto Club. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thanks very much.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show. And while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Manifesto Club at Manifesto Club, and get in touch if you want to suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. Thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon, especially Carl McCann, That covers the cost of keeping the podcast going, and if you could throw in 1% of the cost of a TV licence, or even 0.0001% of the price of a Ryan Tuberty once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The co-producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.